Hi, guys, it's Dr. Sadaf, and I just wanted to give you an update as to what is going on. So, I have opened up my practice in Chappaqua, New York, and I'm currently accepting new patients. So, I want to invite you to come and become a patient of mine. If you've been listening to this podcast, you've been listening to the episodes, you are finding so much value in all of this. I want to invite you to become a patient of mine and come see the difference with a doctor that actually has time to listen to you and support you through the transitions that you may be experiencing, whether they're perimenopause, menopause, or you're experiencing any type of sexual dysfunction. And of course, I do annual GYN exams as well. So if you're not having any problems at all and you just need a regular exam done, I am more than happy to help you out. So make sure you check out the practice. It's called FemV Health, and the website for that is www.femvhealth.com. And make sure you look that up. The phone number for the practice is 914-538-2534. And make sure that you go and check it out. Check out the website and make sure you book your appointment today. Also, I have just started a new Facebook group. It's called It Might Be Menopause Support Group by Dr. Sadaf Lodi, FemV Health. And I'd love for you to come and join that Facebook group, because in that group, we'll be talking about different ways that you can get support and education as you go through this important transition in your life. It's also about building a community that is going through the same things that you are. Oftentimes, we feel that when we go through things in our life that we are the only one. But I'm here to tell you that you are not alone, and that there are so many other women going through the same symptoms that you may be going through, whether it's hot flashes, night sweats, mood swings, vaginal dryness, pain with sex, brain fog, joint pain, dry eyes, any of those things, So come join us in that Facebook group. It's called It Might Be Menopause Support Group by Dr. Sadaf Lodi, and that's on Facebook. So come and join us in that community. And I definitely look forward to welcoming you there. And make sure that if you have any questions about any of the podcasts that I do, that you either DM me or email me, and I will create a podcast just for you, because you are a loyal listener and subscriber. And I would love to answer any and all of your questions. So if you have any burning questions that you are wondering about, please make sure that you email me at hello@femvhealth.com and let me know about your questions, or DM me on Instagram or TikTok, and I'll create an episode just for you. And as always, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. As you know, I am looking to get over 100,000 downloads by the end of this year, and I'd love for you to help me out in that endeavor. And so please share and like these podcasts, download them, and let all your family and friends know, because I know there is not much information out there, and some of the information out there is not actually factual. So you want to make sure that you are getting your medical information from a board-certified OBGYN that knows and has studied all of this material, whether it's sexual medicine, perimenopause, or menopause. So looking forward to hearing from you. And now to the episode. I am an American board-certified OBGYN, a mom, a Muslim, and I'm talking about sex. This is the Muslim Sex Podcast. Welcome to the Muslim Sex Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Sadaf Lodi, and in this episode is everything you need to know about Islam and erotology and its origins, and why perhaps some cultures are more sex positive than others. But before I get into the very first thing I want to make clear is I'm not giving any medical advice, and in this episode you probably won't be getting any. And of course, I'm not giving any type of religious advice. So if you have any questions about your religion, please speak with your friendly neighborhood religious leader. This is the Muslim Sex Podcast because I just happen to be a Muslim woman that talks about sex. So Habeeb Akande, who has been on the podcast a few times before, and I'm so lucky to have him on again. As you can see, I have several of his books. I have one, let's see here, Women of Desire, A Taste of Honey, Kunyaza. I mean, I know he's written so many books, and he's been on the BBC, and he's so well accomplished. I'm so happy to have you on again, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation, Dr. Sadaf, and I'm pleased to appear once again. We had really good conversations the last two episodes, well, the last two appearances that I made, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you again.
Yeah, well, I just think this topic is so important, and of course, who better to ask than you, who wrote the book on Islam and erotology? So let's get right into it. I'm so curious, and I actually had a person reach out to me on Instagram asking me about erotology and what Islam says. So I'd love for you to get a little bit into the origins of erotology and actually what motivated you to look up the origins of erotology in Islam, because I know that isn't what most people, are looking up or even really have the foresight to look into. So I'm so glad you did.
Yeah, so erotology is not a word that many people are familiar with. But I'll just break it down and explain what the word means, and then in terms of the origin, in terms of the Islamic science and how it's developed over the years. So erotology is made up. It's obviously an English word, originally from the word eros, meaning like passionate love, and ology, meaning to study something. So it's the study of passionate love, the study of desire, the study of intimacy and sex and things like that. That's what erotology is. It's not really used as much nowadays. So like it's a kind of a precursor of the modern day sexology. So sexology we understand is the study of human sexuality, and sexology as a science, shall we say, that really started in the 19th century. Whereas erotology, in terms of the study of not only human sexuality but sexual desire, sexual ethics, the philosophy around sex, it's an ancient tradition.
Wow.
It's something that obviously within the Arab and Muslim world, which we're going to talk about in terms of Islamic erotology, but we also have some erotology text from ancient India. So the Kama Sutra will be considered to be a book of Hindu erotology. So erotology, in terms of the discipline, is not anything new. The difference between, and why I personally prefer to use erotology as opposed to sexology, is sexology, like I said, it's kind of seen as a science which is more scientific based, whereas erotology is not just based on scientific, but it's also based on people's personal experiences or research that they've gathered, or speaking from a philosophical or religious perspective. Whereas sexology or sexologists generally don't really delve into those matters, and sexologists will consider their findings to be somewhat objective, whereas erotology is a mixture of the research is a mixture of subjective and objective like research that they've
Mm.
come across, because obviously they're speaking either from their own personal perspective, their cultural perspective, their philosophical perspective, or their religious perspective. So like we've got the Kama Sutra, which many people are familiar with, which is a book about erotology but from a Hindu perspective, and the author of Kama Sutra, Bhatyana, when he wrote the book, he essentially was a compiler. So he compiled different sources from ancient India, what people had said about male female relationships. And it's not a book, just to make it quite clear for people, although the Kama Sutra is known to be a book about sex positions, most of the book is not about sex positions. It's like less than 25% of the book actually deals with positions. It's more about intimacy, courtship, desire. And it was really written for the elite men of ancient Indian
Mm.
society, who were known to be like have multiple female partners, whether by way of marriage or courtesans. And it was teaching men how to kind of be more of a cultured man, to not be like a bestial man. So it was kind of teaching them ethics in those times. So that's what Hindu erotology was about. Now, coming to from the Muslim perspective, so in the Muslim world, when a number of the Muslims came across the Kama Sutra in the 9th century, so a number of those books were translated into Arabic. When a number of the Muslims, particularly in Baghdad, in Iraq, a number of the Muslims, and there was also some Christian Muslims as well, came across works like the Kama Sutra in originally Sanskrit, which was translated, like I said, into Arabic. They also came across some works by ancient Greek philosophers as well as some works from ancient Persians. So what the Muslims scholars did, they wanted, because again these were different, and they considered them to be beneficial sciences, to study these sciences, but then also talk about these sciences, but for their audiences. So you could say they translated and took that which they felt was beneficial or conducive to their society, and then you could say they adapted it but spoke about within a framework from an Islamic perspective or a Muslim perspective in 9th century and 10th century and Baghdad. So that's like the origin of erotology. In Arabic, it's known as ilm al-bah or ilm al-nikah, meaning the knowledge of sex or the knowledge of intimacy. So in Arabic, al-bah means sex or sexual intercourse, or it could also mean sexual potency. Because originally, one of the main reasons why a lot of those Muslim writers were studying erotology was because they was trying to help people who were struggling in terms of erectile dysfunction, loss of desire. So common issues which sexual health professionals like yourself deal with. That's what they were speaking about. But they also was reliant upon the medical advice at their time, which was either from the medical or physicians at their time, or they looked at what ancient Greek philosophers had said about how to treat impotence, how to treat loss of desire, and a range of issues that they faced in their time. So it originally started as like a medical science, and then it developed to not only speak about sex from a medical framework, but also to speak about sex in terms of from a pleasure framework, in the sense of teaching men about the importance of women's sexual pleasure, about sexual ethics, about techniques, and the like. So that's a bit of the backdrop in terms of erotology. It started, like I said, around the ninth century, so about 300 years after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and it's developed over time. So since the first books of erotology was written in the ninth century, you've had different scholars, primarily from the Arabic speaking world, and also some from North Africa, and also some from Turkey, up until maybe like the 17th century, where a lot of scholars from different parts of the Muslim world was writing about erotology from their particular cultural framework.
Fantastic. So I'm so glad you gave us that background and the difference between erotology and sexology. I never knew that difference. I'm curious to find out and get from your perspective what you think. Do you feel that, the study of erotology in the beginning was mostly focused on male sexual dysfunction to mostly help men, or do you think it was, both for men and for women? Because I know that in your book, when you talk about the women of desire, you do mention what the Prophet, peace be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, had said about, men pleasuring their wives and making sure that they also enjoy the act and, the intimacy, and why the intimacy is so important, and making a woman feel secure and safe, which of course adds to the emotional intimacy. But do you feel that in the beginning it was mostly geared for men, or do you think it was perhaps in the pre-Islamic era, it was mainly geared toward men, and then as Islam came, it was for both?
Great question. So, like I mentioned, so a number of the Arab Muslim erotologists, I mentioned that they studied a lot of from what the ancient Greeks and ancient Indians had written.
Right.
Now, a lot of the ancient Greeks, their focus was mainly on male pleasure and sorting out male sexual dysfunction for male gratification purposes. Whereas a lot of the Muslim erotologists, they're almost more focused on women's sexual satisfaction because of the hadiths that he alluded to of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, encouraging men to ensure that their wives were sexually satisfied. So they took a different take. So whilst they took some of the knowledge from the ancient Greeks, they were more focused on women's sexual pleasure. And one of the differences as well from the erotologists compared to the Muslim legal scholars known as the fuqaha is that a lot of the Muslim legal scholars in the discipline of fiqh, like Islamic law, they were mainly speaking about sex being about men's pleasure, and that women were primarily there to serve the men, whereas erotologists took a different take. So that's why these two different disciplines, and it's not uncommon, which we'll probably speak about later, whilst a number of Muslims, obviously we know a lot about fiqh, or we hear about Muslims who've studied fiqh, and the approach is kind of seen as, in their framework, that sex is for the man, and the woman is there to serve the man. And you obviously, I'm sure people are familiar with some of the hadiths that unfortunately people will use to kind of manipulate women or to make women feel as if they're just there to serve their husbands. Whereas the erotologists, a lot of those hadiths, they don't mention them. They were well aware of those hadiths, but because even though their target audience was men, it was teaching them about to ensuring that, and what one of a really great book of erotology written in the 10th century called Encyclopedia of Pleasure. This author, he said that in the beginning of this book, he said this book is for, he called Zarif and Labib. So Zarif is a sophisticated, cultured man, and a Labib is someone who's got intelligence and someone of understanding. And he said this is aimed at a person of intellect. So you can distinguish yourself from the common man who makes love to a woman like an animal. This is not for you. This is in order to educate you so you don't make love to your woman like an animal, like the common people do. And he was inspired by the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, teaching men not to fall upon your wife like an animal. So again, the approach of the erotologist was one which, although the primary audience was men, but it was for women. And
Mm.
that's kind of like the difference between, I would say, the erotologists and you could say the Muslim scholars of the legal tradition who were speaking about, sometimes they spoke about ethics, but it was more about the legality of this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. Whereas the erotologist was more speaking about ethics, and that's why it changed over time. So if you were to come across a book of erotology written in 10th century Iraq, is very different to a book that of erotology written in the 16th century during Ottoman period, because they're speaking to a different audience and the cultures have changed. So that's why for me, when I came across this great and rich erotic tradition, I was thinking, this is what I think a lot of Muslims are lacking, because I think a lot of Muslims are so fixated upon like the legality and like legalism, where it's like a strict adherence to the rule or to the law, without and sometimes losing sight of the ethics and the principles and the spirit of Islamic law. So that's why you have a number of Muslims who everything is questioning. Is this halal? Is this haram? Is this allowed? And it's like, if you are looking at things through the prism of love, connection, intimacy, you're not thinking within that framework. The same way, if you've got a friend, you don't think about, oh, it is allowed for me to do this, and you don't think about it like that. It's compromise. And I think with male female relationships, unfortunately, because maybe in some Muslim communities have grown up to be in a very segregated, obviously, society where they're not used to the opposite sex, and even when they get married, it's still like the relationship is one of like a transactional. I give you this, you give me that. I'm giving you maintenance. I'm giving you food. Therefore, you're going to give me intimacy. And it's not. That wasn't, in my understanding, that wasn't how the Prophet peace be upon him. That wasn't how the Quran spoke. How marriage and intimacy should be framed. But if you read the books of fiqh, and don't get me wrong, I did study fiqh and I do love fiqh, but you need to understand fiqh with ethics, not by itself. But if you study the laws of fiqh, and it's just the laws of this is halal, this is haram, if that shapes your understanding about male female relationships, you'll just view marriage as a transaction. And all of the relationship is very transactional. Whereas if you're looking at relationships from a more ethical framework, which I think a lot of what the erotologists were trying to do, it's a case of no, you're trying to aspire to be better, trying to be a better lover. So you're not thinking about the laws. So yeah, sorry if I went on a bit, but I just think a number of like things I've seen online recently, and again, I think it's because a number of Muslims are really stuck with again the so-called legalism approach as opposed to trying to embody the ethical and the spirit of the law, which I think a lot of the early Muslim scholars were trying to teach, but some of that has been lost for a number of Muslims nowadays.
I think that's so true. I think that we are just not raised, and I'm only speaking for myself and the community that I was in. You're just not raised in thinking about like intimacy and relationships and how to foster that, right? I think that a lot, and I'd love for you to get into this a little bit as well, as why certain communities are more sex positive than others, right? Like growing up in a very Southeast Asian traditional community, right? You're just thinking about like you're always told what's right and what's wrong. And when you talk about segregation, the boys and the girls are always segregated. And so, but then when you go off to school, you're not segregated. So then they don't know how to interact. They don't know, what's permissible, what's not. And it gets really confusing. So I think if you are raised with only learning the black and the white, then I think you miss out on all of the intricacies, right? And even that in relationships, and how do you foster a relationship? And like you said, so many of our marriages are very transactional, and we just don't create. That's what's lacking, I feel, in our marriages, is that intimacy, is that emotional connection, right? How do you foster that when all you've been raised with is always learning what's right, what's wrong, don't do this, don't do that, and then all of a sudden you're married and you don't know anything else.
Yeah, yeah. So even for myself, just by way of background, I'm born into a Nigerian Muslim household. But so obviously London's a very cosmopolitan city, and we have. So I initially attended a predominantly Nigerian mosque, but it was in a predominantly South Asian Desi mosque. So we used to rent the
Mm.
mosque for a period of time. So, but with Nigerian Muslims, I'm generalizing here, but the communities I grew up in, male female relationships is quite relaxed. It's not like even when there's talks, there's men and women sitting amongst themselves, obviously in different sides, but there's no partition in between. So it's quite relaxed. But I notice, like when I go to some lectures that's predominantly South Asian, it's very strict. You don't really, I mean, segregated. You don't see the women. And that was always something that I wasn't sure, is this because we're both Muslims, but the interpretation or how we practice in terms of not the way we pray, but relationship is quite different.
Right.
And then also when I used to visit some predominantly Arab mosques, because there's also a number of Arab mosques not too far from where I grew up. It was in between, so it wasn't as relaxed as the West African my upbringing, and it wasn't as strict as the South Asian. So somewhere in between kind of thing. So I was always interested in terms of what is the Islamic way, so to speak, or is it just different interpretations? And then from when I wanted to further my study, and I went to Egypt after I graduated from university, again, I was also, but then I kind of embraced a more of a conservative, hardline understanding of Islam, because I bought into this idea of like a Salafi understanding, like very strict gender segregation.
Mhm.
Women are all fitna, X, Y, Z. So when I went to Egypt, I was struck by, it was similar to my Nigerian Muslim community. And then when I actually started to study, and a lot of the lectures was teaching in terms of and breaking things down in terms of why there's this different interpretation amongst different scholars, and then how that is understood in different communities, that helps me understand, okay, why some Muslim scholars, like, they see women as just a source of fitna, and they don't even take accountability for men. It's just about kind of like blaming the women, or we need to put women, hide them away because of fitna. Whereas
Mhm.
other scholars didn't interpret it that way. So that's why you can find different Muslim communities who don't see women just as a source of temptation, whereas other communities, they do so. So that's probably explained in terms of the differences. Now, why some communities are a bit more relaxed than others, without trying to make this a history lesson. So after
Okay.
after
I
the
don't mind.
colonized, after, because if we were to take it back, and this would even shock a lot of even Muslims, is that if we were to start with the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the first three generations, we had, or in that society, there were obviously Muslim women that were wearing, some Muslim women wearing niqab. There were some Muslim women that were wearing hijab. There were some Muslim women that was not wearing hijab, and there were some Muslim women that was even bare chested, which would shock a lot of people in the prophetic community of Medina. And this is historical fact. This is not anything new I'm making up, because you had Muslims, you had non-Muslims, and you had enslaved people, women as well. And the injunctions for women who were enslaved were not the same as free women. And I know, again, a number of Muslims are shocked by that, but that's just the reality. So they didn't have this concern, like this. I don't know whether you can call it a type of schizophrenia, sexual schizophrenia, where every time they saw a woman, it was like fitna and lower your gaze, and there was very healthy interactions. Now, as Muslims, as Islam or Muslims expanded and obviously went to different lands, obviously they adopted some of the cultural practices. So in some cultures it's more reserved, and others it's a bit more relaxed, and their respected scholars adapted to their particular community. Now fast forward to when the Muslims were colonized in the 19th century or what have you, a number of Muslims began to adopt a very conservative approach and a Victorian approach towards male female relations and human sexuality, where women are considered to be the temptress, they're considered to be, problematic, so we need to keep them away to protect men. So that type of rhetoric, unfortunately, and that kind of developed, especially amongst those who are very religious or practicing, shall we say. So you have a lot of maybe the religious leaders, the scholars, that's how they're interpreting fitna or temptation, is that we need to protect. And you still hear that rhetoric, and you still see it today, because their understanding is that we need to prevent temptation. So if a man sees, and you see some strange, legal rulings, like a woman should not go to the mosque, especially if she's attractive. If she's not attractive, it's fine. But all of, yeah, it's, yeah, or you
That's
can shake,
random.
hands with a woman, but if she's attractive, you can't shake hands with her. Or if she's over the ages of 50, you can shake hands with her because she has no desire. So a lot of these kind of like really ridiculous, and I think as well, because what happened in a number of Muslim circles is that the scholars, or predominantly men, were just speaking amongst themselves. So they're just speculating, and just, so that's why when I was even studying and reading some of these rulings, I'm just thinking, where are they getting all this from?
Right, like, and who's
Yeah,
defining who's good looking, who's not?
right,
Like,
exactly. But it's subjective. That's the thing. That's also another thing that people, when reading classical text, one needs to contextualize. This might not necessarily be for my audience. So some problematic statements I came across is a number of North African scholars that I studied under the Maliki Madhab. They would say, if a woman is black, she doesn't need to wear a niqab, a face veil, because she's not a source of temptation.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I was like, well, where'd you get that from? Now,
So,
they were saying, not justifying or condoning what they were saying, but their rationale was in their environment, both in North Africa and in Islamic Spain, black women weren't considered to be desirable. Therefore, there's no fitna. So because there's no fitna, she doesn't need to cover wear her face. So that was their logic. And but then people were taking some of their legal rulings, and this is maybe from the 16th century, 17th century, and bringing it to 21st century UK or America, or then saying this is what Islam says. And that's why, even as someone who studied Islamic, I'm trying to explain, because I'm trying to obviously defend the faith, that no, these are some certain people's opinions. It's not necessarily representative of the religion as a tradition, and they speak within their context. So that's why, again, when we're speaking about like male female relations, the same way if you were to ask five different people, like in terms of who is attractive, they will have different answers. Or who do you feel uncomfortable around? Again, you're going to have different. Now, if you have someone who is very naturally uncomfortable, someone that's suffers from social anxiety, shall we say, that person's answer is going to be very different to someone who's very comfortable in social settings. So that's something that, again, I think a number of the scholars did become somewhat of a recluse and wasn't maybe interacting much with people. So that's why a lot of the rulings can seem quite dry and quite harsh, especially towards women. And I think and I saw this myself when I was studying, a number of the people who are studying and they're reading these rulings, these medieval rulings from like the 13th, 15th, 16th century, they're taking these rulings and then they're trying to apply that in 21st century America and the UK, where the culture is very different. They don't have the same hang-ups and hesitations that
right.
we have now. The same way, if you were to ask a scholar like from, just say he's from a very segregated society in Saudi Arabia, and he comes to the UK or New York or some part of America, for him, there'll be a natural culture shock because he's not used to maybe seeing women just going about their business. So he might be like, for the men, it's haram for you to go to university. And I heard these rulings based on this idea of fitna, or it's haram for a woman to leave her house because of XYZ, because he's thinking about in his country. But then he's not factoring that, okay, the legal rulings you're giving to maybe women in Saudi Arabia, you're forgetting that number of those women maybe have maids they're looked after. So you can give those legal rulings to say that maybe I'm not agreeing with it, but a woman doesn't need to drive because she's going to have a chauffeur or a maid. But people, so that's why again I just think as Muslims who are maybe when they study abroad, sometimes they forget to contextualize some of the rulings and also to challenge because you will read like there was a video posted on Instagram a couple of days ago where there was a preacher, quite a popular preacher from the UK, and he was talking about how, and he was citing an ancient or classical Muslim scholar that the woman on top position is bad because it makes a man effeminate, and
What?
it makes a man behave like a woman, and then that will then lead to the woman pegging the man. Now that, yeah, yeah, I'm not lying. Now I read, so when I heard that, I was just like, this is ridiculous. But I know where he's got that from. Now that particular, he cited a classical scholar. That opinion came from ancient Greece because they had
Oh,
that belief. So they were talking about different positions and they said the woman on top position is kind of seen as effeminate and it's wrong. So you had some Muslim scholars who just regurgitate what they've heard. So there's a number of like these, like even like with the whole female genital cutting, you had some scholars who were saying, women, you should cut off the clitoris because it will lower desire. Otherwise, the women will become promiscuous like non-Muslim women. And you had prominent Muslim scholars saying this, but they were citing what a number of ancient Greek philosophers had said because female genital cutting also took place in ancient Greece. So again, so for me, because I'm some of those ways quite curious, when I was coming across some of these rulings, and then sometimes the scholars would give the explanations, I was always intrigued in terms of where did they get this from. But because I think as Muslims, we have obviously a number of us have reverence to, our religious elite, shall we say, or the scholars. Sometimes they don't question actually where you're getting this from or even challenging it. Whereas I think if you look in the first 3, 4 centuries of Islam, the Muslims, both men and women, did challenge the male authority. And that's something which I think is lacking. So even if, and that's why I try to show in the Woman of Desire book is that there were women who were challenging men. And then there were men who were also consulting women about intimate matters. like in terms of, okay, like Umar bin Khattab asking his daughter, how long does a roughly would you say does a woman need before, like if she's away from her husband? And then she said maximum like 4 months. Then he legislated based on the advice of a woman that any man that's away on war shouldn't be away from his wife for more than 4 months. So so then what you find is then scholars who then say that the maximum that a man can go without sleeping with his wife is 4 months. Now, when you're just seeing that ruling, you aren't seeing where it came from. Now,
Sure.
that's based on a ruling that was actually the recommendation of a woman.
So, I think that what you're saying is so true that a lot of times, right, we as, I guess, a community often don't question what we think our scholars are telling us. And, we just believe everything that they say because, one, we may not have time to go back and take a look at the text and figure out what's right, what's wrong, what they mean by that. Or, we just have faith in our leaders or people that are translating for us or, you know, basically telling us what the information is so that we just say, believe whatever it is that they say is true. So I think that when you see these really prominent scholars, and if they're saying something like that, right, you just take it as like, oh, well, that must be the right thing. And you just trust. But I'm glad that you bring up that, sometimes when you hear something that doesn't really make sense, you should really look it up to figure out, is this true? Is it not true? Is it in the context of modern day? Is it, are they taking it out of context? Because I think that's really important as well.
Yeah, very much so. And also just to add, and I think that what I was trying to do with my book on like with some of the work that I'm doing is to amplify Muslim women voices in particular. The reason being is because as men naturally we have blind spots, and if you look at and like in a sense we will see things from a male perspective, and I don't think men should be the only one that's speaking about or governing all matters, because not just to say matters pertaining to women, but all matters that not only women should be inputted, but also women should have this, an equal share in terms of the voice. And I think if you look at, like I said, the early Muslim community in particular, you did have that. You did have many women companions who were just as vocal and active as the men as well. But I think oftentimes people aren't really aware of their contribution. And a lot of the Muslim scholars who came later, the legal jurists, a lot of their rulings, which a lot of people aren't aware of, they were based on the rulings of some of the early women scholars.
Sure.
And that's something that again I just think that because so we know about a lot of the male scholars and you hear about them, but not many people are aware of that they were inspired or they got their rulings from maybe a female
Mm,
companion or woman scholar, and they kind of forget that. So I think that's kind of got lost because when you could say Islam became more or Islamic law became more formulated and you had these set like legal rulings or fiqh became really established as a discipline, women weren't as actively involved in that arena, and that's why you don't
right,
really have as much um, women scholars in terms of jurists as opposed to like the first three generations. Because if you look at the first three generations, you see so many stories of women, whereas in after like you could say the fourth generation, it kind of decreases, and then you only hear maybe some of their voices in terms of maybe some scholars referencing a woman said such and such. But in terms of the interpretation, this is where I think is where it becomes challenging for us now. Is that you could say from like the fourth century up until like very recent times, even arguably up until today, you will have just predominantly men that's interpreting. Whereas before you had women that was interpreting and challenging the men, and then that had even the men to even rethink. So even if it was a man who was the Muslim caliph, he would and a woman challenging him, then okay, maybe seeing it from a different perspective. But because I don't think we have enough of those voices, it's just
yes.
men just sitting around amongst ourselves. So naturally, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So you have ridiculous conversation, or you have people who have had maybe very little experience in terms of with women. Maybe they just maybe have their mother, their sister, a few female family members, and maybe their wife, but maybe she's not as a dynamic as someone in terms of who can challenge his authority or even what he's saying. So he's thinking, oh, I've consulted women because I've consulted my mother and my wife, and it's just like it doesn't work like that, you know.
Right.
So that's what I just think. I definitely think that's something which there's one thing celebrating our past or talking about how great Islam is, but I think the religion in of itself should be something which is applicable and helpful for people like living in our modern day um, age. But I just think we need to understand first our tradition and then understand because I don't believe in like I don't subscribe to the whole idea that all of the scholars were misogynistic and but there is misogynistic sentiment. I'm not going to deny that. and we should like leave everything that they've built, because I think we can build upon that what they built, and that which again we don't agree with, what's not applicable to our times, then you could just leave it. It's just, but you have to be familiar with the foundation, because
Right.
if you're not familiar with the foundation, you're just going to think everything that they've said is it either their interpretation or is actually legislated from, extracted from the Quran or the Hadith, and it's a valid interpretation. So that's where one needs to have a real kind of like interaction with it and familiar with the text, and then again see what is an interpretation and that which is not an interpretation, and where it's an interpretation, which a lot of rulings are based on interpretation, based on a particular age, then you don't necessarily need to follow it.
Right. I think, sometimes you come across people and, it just seems like everything is either right or wrong, right? Black or white. And I think that a lot of younger children that are growing up now, find a little bit of, I don't know. I think they feel discouraged, right? Like they feel that, well, it seems like everything I'm doing is wrong. So I'll just forget it. I'll just leave. Perhaps there are some people that are leaving the faith, or maybe they're just not doing what the faith says because they feel that it's just so constrictive, and they're not even able to talk to a person of the opposite gender because, they're seen as doing something wrong when it's not wrong, and I think that there's a lot of different sentiments. So I think that it's really important that we hear, people like you that, go ahead and understand the context, but then also can apply it to modern day. I know that you also talked a little bit about consent in marriage and marital rape. And I know that there have been Instagram posts about it, and perhaps some people think that there isn't such a thing. Of course, you and I both know that there is, of course, such thing as marital rape. And, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that hadith. People have asked me about that. And I'll be honest, I don't really know all the rulings on that, but and I'm sure you probably know about the hadith that I'm referring to, about if a woman denies her husband, right, and he wants to be intimate with her, he wants to have sex with her, and that if she says no to him, then there's an angel that curses her all night. Can you tell me a little bit about that hadith? I'm not sure. I'm sure you've heard of it, of course.
Yeah, sure. So that hadith, it does appear in different variations. In an authentic report where the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is reported to have said that if a man calls his wife to the bedroom for intimacy and she refuses, or she doesn't come, then one variation of the hadith says the angels curse her. Another variation says that if the curse her until morning. There's another hadith that says that God will be angry with her. There's another hadith that says that if a woman is on a saddle, like on a camel, and he calls her for intimacy, she should respond, like even if she's on a saddle, or even if she's cooking. Now, one thing that people need to realize is with these genre of hadiths, they are, from my understanding, how I've understood of how I've been taught, is that the intention behind those hadiths is to encourage women to comply with their husband's sexual advances, not that women should be forced. That's the first thing. So now we'll talk about marital rape in the sense. There are some modern day scholars who've questioned like the authenticity of these hadiths, because what you find in hadith literature is that because a hadith is authentic, like Sahih, it doesn't necessarily mean it's accepted. And that's something that a lot of Muslims don't understand the difference between the two, because there are hadiths that's in Bukhari and Muslim, and that's what Muslims will say, oh, it's in Bukhari, it's in Muslim, which is an authentic compilation of hadiths. Not every hadith that is in Bukhari, and when they mean it's authentic, what scholars mean is that the how it's been reported is authentic. It
Mm.
fulfills the conditions, meaning that it's sound. But the text itself, the narration, might not necessarily be authentic, and that's why you even have some hadiths that have different wordings. Because when people narrate hadiths, sometimes they either narrate it how they've heard it word for word, or they narrate their understanding of the intended meaning. So the same way, if you're having a conversation with someone, you might tell the other person word for word what this person said, or you give what you thought they've said. Now, when you give like the intended meaning, now you might have not understood exactly what the person had meant, or you might have embellished, and even that even also happened during the time of the Prophet. Sorry, the time of the companions, which I want to speak about in terms of the importance of having women scholars as well. Is that there was several companions, male companions, who they narrated part of a hadith, and then Aisha, the Prophet's wife, when she heard that, she said, "You've misquoted the Prophet. You mentioned
Mm.
half of the hadith." So there's
Mm.
one hadith, a famous hadith, where Abu Hurairah reported that there's no good in three things, or there's like an evil omen in three things. I think it was women, horses, and something else. And then she said, "No, you've misquoted. The prophet said the people of the past or other nations used to say there's no good in three things. Then he mentioned those three things, including women, not meaning he was saying that, but he
Sure.
just quoted the latter part. So that's like an example where you can have, and that hadith is still in Bukhari now. So that's like an example of where you can have a hadith, and there's several examples where Aisha was correcting. There's another hadith, famous hadith, where I think it was Abu Hurairah, another male companion, who said that if a woman passes by you, then your prayer is nullified. And then again, she corrected him and said, "You've misunderstood that hadith, or the Prophet didn't say that because there was times when he would pray and I'm sleeping in front of him and he would just maybe move my hand." So she knows that from first-hand experience that either you haven't understood that hadith or you've misquoted it. So the fact
Mm.
that that happened in amongst the companions, like different understandings, I'm not surprised that you have these different understandings. Now, for me, I'm like the more when I reflect on it, I think some of the I've even understood it as if the Prophet peace be upon him did actually say that sometimes, and that you do find this in some hadiths that the Prophet would use like hyperbolic speech, like this, like there's a hadith that says that between the prayer between what's the difference between a Muslim and a non-Muslim is a prayer, and if you stop praying, that you like essentially you leave the religion, but that it doesn't mean that literally, like in terms of if someone's not praying, they're a non-Muslim. So if someone were to read that hadith literally, they will say, oh, this person is a non-Muslim because they're not praying anymore. So you do have a number, and there's been some modern day scholars, like I said, who've tried to give an explanation in terms of the intended meaning of that hadith. And I think that's something that's also very important. But one thing I do want to emphasize and make it very clear, I don't believe that, and what I've been taught, that hadith should be used like weaponized to manipulate women or to force them or to coerce them into having sexual relations. And although that hadith is mentioned in Bukhari, in a number of the earlier books of hadith, like the Muwatta, which was written in compiled in like the third century, it's not mentioned. And that was like a more of a classical book, and that's the book that I study. So that's why I'm always for me as well. I just look at it like, even when I used to read that hadith, I was like, okay, that's quite strange. I never really understood, is that true or it's not. But whether it's true or not, it's not something that I would use, if that makes sense. I'm
Hmm.
more troubled how people, and I see it a lot, how even like preachers love to bash and use a hadith like again against women as well, and then obviously men will be doing that in the bedroom, so much so that, and I'm sure you've received a number of messages as well of a number of women thinking that they don't have the right to say no.
Right.
That's tragic. Like to
Yeah.
think that Islam doesn't give me that right. Like I'm like, and this is something that, because I've always believed that of course a woman has a right to say no. She has the man has to have consent. Even when I was writing my books, I never really went into too much detail on it, because for me it was like, if Allah is telling men, وَعَاشِرُهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, live with your wives in that which is good and that which is kind. That's an instruction from Allah. That's in the Quran. That's clear cut. Of course, how can you force yourself on your wife? It's just common sense.
Right.
If the Prophet has said in several other hadiths, which people, for whatever reason, forget about treating women well, then of course you can't force yourself. So that's why for me it was like it's obvious. I'd maybe just mentioned it in one line, that the Prophet, when he told men to treat women well, that also they have the right of consent. So that was, but I didn't realize, because then when it's maybe in the last couple of years and actually seeing in certain madhabs, in certain legal schools, there are unfortunately some scholars who have said a man can force himself on his wife.
Hmm.
Again, I don't agree with that at all. I just want to make
Yeah.
that clear. And when I've read, and these are some classical scholars from the Hanafi madhab, and the Hanafi madhab is obviously one of the most popular madhab, and this isn't a small or isolated book. This is like a prominent book, and because even when I was reading, in preparation for our talk today, I was reading again what he wrote, the scholar wrote, and he said that because the idea of marriage is, although it's an exchange of, it permits pleasure for both the man and the man has the right to pleasure. So he ignored the woman's right to pleasure, and that's not how I was when I studied it. It was like men and women both have the right to sexual pleasure, but he said because the man has the right to pleasure, he can force himself on her if she refuses to give him his right, unless she has a legitimate reason. So I was
Hmm.
like, oh, so that's, then the light bulb kind of went off. So okay, this is why a number of Muslims now are kind of afraid to kind of categorically say marital rape is haram, or you need consent, because some scholars have said that no, it's permissible. And this is what I was speaking about earlier, is that no, sometimes you can challenge. That's his interpretation. I don't agree with
Right.
it. Yes,
Right.
he was a prominent scholar, and there's other scholars who have said that, but it doesn't mean, and especially when you've got clear evidence teaching us or showing us from the Quran and the Hadith that you're supposed to treat women well. Common sense. Why are you going to? Why do you need? And because even a number of Muslims who are like, oh, there's no such thing as marital rape, because they will say, I've heard people say it's a Western concept, or it's a feminist argument, or because it was only um, conceived in, like, I think 1949 when they first started writing about it. There's no such thing in Islam, and it's just, for me, it's like, of whether you want to call it marital rape or forced intimacy or sexual coercion in marriage, it's all talking about the same thing, that you're not allowed to force yourself, you're not allowed to harm your spouse. It's common sense. But
Right.
because I think, again, a number of Muslims are stuck in, because I can't find the exact definition in a legal text or fiqh that was written 500 years ago, therefore it doesn't exist.
Hmm.
Problem.
Yeah.
And a number of the early Muslim scholars and jurists were speaking about rape, they only spoke about in the context of like property. They described it as like a property crime, because they conceived marriage as somewhat similar to like slavery, where when you marry a woman, you it's like you've it's similar to a slave, where you give her the dowry in exchange for sexual rights or sexual access. That's how they conceived marriage. Again,
Hmm.
very different to the erotology. So that's why, like I said, if you're coming from studying marriage, and again, but they're speaking from a legal framework, they're just talking about the conditions. They're not teaching, and the whole point of the books of fiqh of Islamic law is not teaching people how to be like a better spouse or a good spouse. The same way the books of tasawwuf, like Sufism, or tazkiyah to nafs, purification of the soul, that's dealing with the inner state. That you won't find that in the books of fiqh. So you have these different disciplines, but because Muslims are only familiar with maybe one or two disciplines, they're thinking that's just enough. So yes, in terms of from a legal framework, these are the conditions of what makes marriage halal, or fulfills all the condition that is valid, but that doesn't mean that's how you treat your spouse, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
it's just trying to help, but ultimately, marital rape is haram, it's prohibited. It's not allowed for a man to force himself on his wife. Sexual coercion is not permissible, and I think it's important that Muslims, especially Muslim teachers, educators, sheikhs, and what have you, they need to understand what is consent, because I've listened to a number of troubling YouTube videos recently where people are saying that there's one particular speaker, he said, oh, marital rape is only if it's violent, extremely violent. If she says no, but you do it anyway, that's not rape. And I was like, you said, I no, no, honestly, I couldn't believe, but this is my point, is that he was speaking again, and I can imagine a number of men will be, yeah, I agree, because
Yeah.
that's my wife. Yeah, even if she says no, and he said that even if she says no, even if she's got a headache and you just go anyway, that's not rape. Rape has to be really violent. It has to be like power. And I'm like, that is, and I'm thinking, where you getting that mindset is troubling and is wrong. But then, because no one is really challenging you about that, because obviously you're probably amongst all similar men with similar mindset, you think, yeah, that's what Islam teaches. But if you haven't got other people to kind of actually correct or educate you, then you would think, and again, a number of those women that might have been raised to believe, no, that is what Islam teaches. That's what it means to be a so-called obedient wife or submissive wife. That's what the hadith means. So because that's what, so the women that even they may have relations with, they're not going to contest that. And that's why, again, a number of Muslim imams, religious leaders, because they're the ones that ultimately are teaching from a relatively young age, and it needs to start from a young age, not just when the person's getting married, because there are a number of men who have that understanding that, no, once I pay the dowry, she's this woman is effectively mine. I can do whatever I want with her. That, and that's why, even to hear hadiths or stories how the Prophet facilitated divorce for very easy reasons for women. They just complained, I'm no longer in love with my husband. I'm not attracted to him. He allowed, I'm dissatisfied in the bedroom. He didn't question it. He didn't accuse her. He didn't say, you know, he said, no, you can get a divorce. That's why for a lot of Muslims, that is even hard to imagine, because they have this idea of marriage is one of ownership. That once you've give a woman the mahar and she accepts it, you have complete access to her body. And I would argue that a lot of those ideas have been somewhat formulated by like a lot of heavy or misunderstanding of Islamic fiqh without understanding ethics. Because if you study fiqh by itself, and I've studied fiqh by itself, you will find some troubling opinions. But again, if they're not contextualized or understood within a framework of Islamic ethics, then you can think, oh, that's what the religion teaches.
Yeah. I mean, I think, what I hear you saying is that a lot of times you have to kind of use your own intellect, right? You have to think about like what's being said and then and see whether or not it makes sense, right? Does it make sense to harm somebody? Does it make sense to do something that somebody else doesn't want, right? And if you hear somebody saying that, no, that's fine, that doesn't make sense. You wouldn't do that to, an animal. If an animal doesn't want to do something, you keep forcing it to do something. I mean, that just doesn't make sense. And I think that, a lot of times things are taken out of context and we are not using our own intellect. And I think that over and over again in the Quran, we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to, right? In these are signs for those who reflect. Like Allah is always telling us to reflect, 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 think about things, right? And if something just doesn't make sense, then I would definitely have to question it. And it's unfortunate that we have people that have these social media platforms that are advocating this kind of things where it's actually harmful to another individual to say that it's okay to go ahead and harm your wife or it's okay to go ahead and force yourself. To me, that just doesn't make sense. And I feel very, upset actually thinking that people are accepting this as truth and then going ahead and acting on this. And that just really, it just doesn't give women any rights, right? And that's actually the opposite of the book that you've written, which talks about the women of desire, right? And it talks about all the rights that women have and the importance of satisfying women and why. I mean, it just doesn't even make sense. Why would the Prophet, peace be upon him, say that it was okay for a woman to divorce their husbands if they were sexually unsatisfied? Right, if that wasn't the case, if it was okay to go ahead and force yourself. And it's interesting that you bring all this up because I've had friends of mine that have wanted to discuss intimacy and this and that, and they will say that oftentimes they don't feel they don't feel like being intimate with their partner. They don't feel like having sex, and but they just do it anyways because they think, one, it's their obligation, two, that they just want to get it over with. They see it as like a chore. They just like, whatever, just get it done and then move on. That they're not interested in all. And I just think, like, how sad is that? That one, they can't even communicate with their partner. They can't communicate what their desires are, what they really want, what they don't want, and two, that they themselves don't really have an understanding of what their legal rights are, right? That their sexual rights in Islam and what their rights are, and that they have a right to be pleasured and to enjoy what they're doing, and they just think that it's their obligation, so they just go ahead and do it even if they don't enjoy it.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think a number of the stories about women's rights, I don't think a lot of women are aware of that.
Yeah.
So there are at least two or three instances I can think of off the top of my head where even during the time of the Prophet's life, where one of his wives refused him in the bedroom and he accepted it. It happened and it's a hadith, authentic hadith of the woman of Jurania, when he first married the night of, I think it was Salama when she was breastfeeding. And there was another of his wife who was fearful, but she just said she didn't want to consummate the marriage at the time. He didn't say anything. They consummated the marriage later. But my point is, these stories are not being told to the women. So they're just hearing one side. So that's a problem. So it's like, they're not understanding that sometimes when you're hearing a hadith or you're hearing instructions towards men, you're not hearing other instructions towards women. Or they're just hearing the instructions towards women, they're not hearing the instructions towards men that don't be forceful, don't be like an animal with your wife and things like that. So this is where, again, it is troubling because, again, I didn't realize how much. It's only when I really started to pay attention, because when I used to hear some of these wild things, I just used to just ignore it. But how much people actually believe, no, this is actually what
Right.
religion teaches, and then people have been, for years have bought into this idea that you can't say no, or you can't even communicate because your husband might start thinking, where did you get these ideas from? Are you this? And it's just like, and this is within a marital home. It's just, but again, this is why work needs to be done with the men as well, because if women are being empowered and believe and know that they have a right to sexual satisfaction, which is great, if the men aren't also receiving that same messaging where they're creating a space where the woman feels safe and she
Right.
can vocalize her desire, that's going to be a problem. So that's where I think the women are more than on board, but it's a problem I'm finding is that a lot of the men are finding it like this is not Islamic, or this is, and that's why I have to give examples from the time of the Prophet peace be upon him, or scholars that they respect. It's not me that's saying this. I'm giving you, so then they can, then they can start maybe questioning, okay, their understanding of what it means to be a so-called good woman, and she can't, it's maybe that will change because, yeah, it is like I said, it is very troubling because there is a lot of work that needs to be done, but at the same time, I'm trying to be quite optimistic, but it's just quite, yeah, it can be quite disheartening because yeah, some of the stories or messages I've heard is just like, yeah,
Yeah. It's bad, right? It can, yeah, definitely can be really disheartening. So I think it's really important that people, listen to people like you and
and yourself.
apply
Sorry,
to
I don't want to cut you off. Sorry, I don't want to cut you off. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. But that's why, again, even for people like yourself, and to amplify voice, because what I'm also frustrated with is sometimes when people make out like there's no Muslim women that are speaking about this, or there's no professionals, and there is, but maybe you're not aware of them. So that's
yes,
why also for men as well, and not to have this idea that the only women that can speak are those who are. And again, if a woman wants to wear a veil or niqab, that's fine. But this idea that it's only women that are fully covered and you can only see their eyes, they're the only ones that's allowed to speak. And if a woman is showing her hair or she's not wearing a niqab, then all of a sudden I have to be like this. So it's just like, it's pathetic because when you go into the real world, you don't behave like that. But for whatever reason, in a religious sphere,
yep,
people just have this behavior that is just, and I'm just, it's for me, I'm not. For me, it's a lot of it's performative piety. If I'm honest with you, because I don't buy it. Because again, these aren't people that's living in the middle of a desert where they have very little interactions with women. But they make it out that that's the case when they go into religious setting. That all of a sudden, but they'll have they can't have a I'm adults at the end of the day. So that's why for me, that's why I just think the men need to kind of be a bit more. It's changing somewhat because I think if you remember the Islamic content, if we look back maybe 25 years ago, like I'm sure my age now, but like in the universities, you'd never have a woman on the panel. The only women that could, even a woman could ask a question, she'd have to write it down on a notepad. She'd have to bring it down. It was very so. It's even changed from where now in a lot of, I'm assuming in a lot of universities with Islamic conferences, both in the US and the UK, it's not like that. You have women speaking. You have women speaking to both men and women. Women can answer questions. But for me, I always used to find it quite ridiculous. I wasn't really that practicing then, but I used to find it quite ridiculous because I'm like, we're in a mixed gender university. You're going to be sitting with men and women, but then all of a sudden you go to the Islamic, and it's all of a sudden, no, brother, go to one side, sister. You can't see. Put your head down, and it's like even if a woman's wearing the club, put your head down. It's like this is creating a. I just like honestly, that's what I'm just thinking. Where are you getting this from? And
absolutely.
that's creating this like repression,
Yes.
like this attitude where you're looking at women as if they're just purely a sexual object, and it's like they haven't got a mind, or you can't, or you think you're just possessed, that you can't control yourself. And reading some of these texts, these ancient texts, can give you that impression. Like, so you read, oh, this great scholar, mashallah, he said that once when he looked at, people might attack me for the story, but when I read that, I was like, this great scholar that he said once when he saw a woman's ankle, he couldn't memorize something again for 6 months. That shows how if you purify yourself and you keep away from women, and I'm just like, it's just but you do find these stories and they are kind of looked at, oh, this is why, the importance of lowering your gaze, because he said he just caught a glimpse of a woman's ankle, and because of that, he wasn't able to memorize anything for 6 months.
See,
So everyone's aspiring to that state, and I just think that is just,
I
sorry, go
feel
on.
I feel that that says more about the person themselves than about the other individual. It just means that you can't control your own self. So perhaps you work on your own self, then you worry about others. I love the term. I never heard of it before, but I love the term what you just said, performative piety. And I think that so many of us have that, right? So many of people in our communities have that, where they're going around, you see them outside of the masjid, right? They're like somebody else. All of a sudden you see them inside the mosque and they're like, oh my God, I can't talk to you. You can't, it's
Yeah,
just It's
Yeah.
crazy. It really is just absolutely. I agree with you. I think a lot of it is performative. Before we run out of time, I do want to just talk a little bit about how different cultures view sexuality, right? We have some, you and I talked a little bit about this offline, but like, Southeast Asians tend to be very conservative. Of course, Southeast Asians are not a monolith, but I really think that a lot of us are, and we grow up with a lot of baggage. I mean, tons of baggage. It's awful, right? I mean, you can't even talk. There's a huge taboo. You don't have anyone that you can talk to. I mean, I did a whole TED talk on this, and it's just how, like, it's just really tough. And then, like you have some Arabs tend to be a little bit more sex positive. Maybe they understand that there's sexual rights in Islam. I actually spoke to the son of a sheikh here, and he was telling me how his dad actually sat down with him before he got married and explained to him that women have sexual rights and really important to you for you to please your wife, this and that. And I was like, that is amazing. I don't think anyone has that conversation with anyone from Southeast Asia. No one knows about this. When I talk to people about women having sexual rights in Islam, they're floored. They had no idea. I didn't have any idea, honestly, until I read your book, and I was like, oh my God, I had no idea. So I mean, I just think that we just don't talk about these things. And because we don't talk about them, they become enshrouded in like taboo and shame and guilt and all this nonsense that we carry with us. And then we never learn about it. And then we start believing these scholars that tell us that, that men can force themselves onto their wives, and then all this stuff. I mean, there's so many problems there, and then I'm not sure. I mean, I'd love to hear from you, and you can tell me what, perhaps some African cultures are very sex positive. And I know you mentioned that in your books. You also mentioned that in, I think you talked about it on your Instagram platforms and things like that. So I find it to be so interesting. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I definitely think, like generally speaking, for the Muslim world, colonization did have a detrimental effect to ways we view sexuality. And some cultures, I would argue, especially maybe like some South Asian cultures, did inherit a more of a puritanical approach towards sexuality than others, like maybe in West Africa and parts of the Arab world. And it's quite interesting as well, and quite strange as well, because prior to colonization, the Indian subcontinent wasn't as repressed, as puritanical as it is now. And
Right.
even if you read some of the books of like even like the saying that the oldest profession in the world, and referring to prostitution, that was originated by, I think it was Richard Kipling, but it was a British writer speaking about
Mm.
Indian sex workers, and he was speaking about, because he was surprised how women were free. And then
Mm.
he was talking about how, like, the women there are very promiscuous, and that you can see that type of idea where people say, oh, we need to be so pure, that in any even conversation about sex was considered to be extremely taboo. And they inherited, I would argue, like the Victorian concept of like this puritanical mindset, because it wasn't like that even prior to like maybe like the 17th, 16th century. It was as puritanical. And there's also some Muslims who inherited some I would argue some Hindu beliefs, especially in relation to
Yes.
the divorced women and things like that, where you can see in other parts of the Muslim world, like in parts of West Africa and parts of North Africa, and part of the Arab world, that divorce, there is that stigma. So you do find that unfortunately some Muslims have inherited some other cultures in terms of their attitude towards women, even those that are Muslim, unfortunately. Now, with the Arabs, and what's quite interesting is that even amongst like North Africans, and I would argue Arabs in the peninsula, is also quite different. I've noticed that North Africans are even a bit more progressive, or more comfortable, shall we say, speaking about human sexuality. And a lot of the books that were written primarily in French, but also some in English, of Arab Muslims of North Africa, they're speaking very candidly about human sexuality. Now, I'm not sure if that's because maybe their culture was as a bit more relaxed as well compared to Arabs in the peninsula. But it's interesting because when I speak to Arabs or um, experts from that part of the world, they will talk about um, how puritanical their culture is. So it's interesting when you're saying, oh, in comparison to South Asia, at least you're having that conversation. We don't have that conversation. Then they might compare themselves to maybe West Africa or Europe or parts of East Africa, and saying they're even having this conversation during marriage, whereas we just have that one conversation just before marriage, and that's it. Because for a number of Arabs, like there's a Instagram page, I think it's Moj, and they do a lot of work, particularly for Arab women. They talk about how we don't have any conversation. Just the night before the wedding, you're having this conversation and that's it. Or the man is having that conversation and it's like, okay, but maybe that's not enough for like that 5 minute conversation. And in terms of like how to treat a woman, in terms of how to maintain a healthy love and relationship, that's also another conversation altogether. That's not normally had. So it's interesting that you spoke about like they still do have that because a number of Arabs I speak to that we don't have anything, but they do have
Mm.
something, but maybe not as much as another culture. Whereas, and then in parts of West Africa and also parts of East Africa, which is obviously why I wrote the Kunyas, is like it's very. And even when I visited Rwanda and Kenya for a couple of weeks, and I was surprised. It's very open, like in terms of very candid to have this conversation, both men and women alike, of different ages. It wasn't seen; it was just seen as something that's natural, and it was seen as organic. Not that they didn't have any like modesty, but it was just no. They can have these age appropriate conversations about sexuality, about intimacy, about women's right to pleasure for both men and women alike, because they realize this is something that men men have this are entitled to this, and likewise women are entitled to this. But there's more emphasis placed on men ensuring that the women are pleasured, and that's something that I was really quite surprised by because it was taught from a really young age that this is something the same way men are taught from a really young age that you're supposed to provide for your wife financially. You're also supposed to provide for her in the bedroom, and in order to provide for her in the bedroom, you need to make sure she's comfortable and feel safe outside of the bedroom. So it's not just about learning these techniques, and that's also what I'm trying to help people understand. It's not just you learn the kunyaza technique and then it's all well and good. No, you need to make sure she was comfortable in your space. You need to create intimacy. So that's something that if you don't have a healthy relationship, not only I would say with your wife or your female partner, with women in general, because if you've just got this archaic medieval mindset that like, oh, there's fitna everywhere, but it's only at home. That's where I've got my sakina. And but it's like, it doesn't work that way. You just need to be able to respect women and know, because even I put up a post about different reasons why women avoid intimacy. And I was getting a number of posts like saying, well, I didn't realize that. And I'm just like the first thing a number of the men were saying was just like, A, she's cheating on me, or she's using sex as a weapon, or the third one, and I got that from about at least 6 different men. And I'm obviously they won't post it publicly. I know because guys don't post publicly, they'll send me the DM. And I'm like, where are you getting this from? It's like, that's what the scholars have said. And I'm just like, because that's what they will lay out. And then when I'm actually listening to the advice that you're hearing from a lot of the clerics, is the reason why she doesn't cheat on you is because you're not. Are you feeding her properly? Are you giving her good clothes? Is she seeing someone else? Is she making her 5 daily prayers on time? And I'm like, are you
Wow,
honestly? Yeah, sorry. So
we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do. I think that's fantastic, though, actually, that in those cultures that you were talking about in Africa, where they, talk about intimacy and relationships early on, and of course, age appropriate. I mean, gosh, we could learn a lot from those cultures, right? We could learn how to. I mean, I had a whole conversation with somebody that has an online education program, and we talked about how do we start teaching kids about sex education early on, but obviously where it's age appropriate, where they can understand and how do we instill in them values that, consent is important, talking communication is important, that, talking to your partner about what they like, what they don't like, what their desires are, right? Like, how do we get that conversation started? I mean, there's so many people that can't talk to their spouses that they've been married to for, decades, that they cannot talk to them about what their wants are, what their needs are, what their desires are. I mean, I just think that that's really sad. And that says a lot, right? That we just don't know how to communicate with each other. And perhaps that communication, if we were taught that when we were younger, that would make a huge difference. And to just even be comfortable in that space, right, of having those conversations, I think will make a huge difference. So what did you find out? I mean, in those cultures that you visited, how did they create that safe space? Was it about respect? Was it that they're, I can see like little kids maybe giggling or talking, but I'm just curious, how do they create that safe space so people can have those conversations?
I saw a lot of, and this is also amongst the Muslim community as well as non-Muslim community. I saw a lot of friendship between men
Hmm.
and women,
Oh.
as in, and I think that's really important because, and someone actually said it, but I didn't really think about it at the time that my wife, it was like his wife, another person said, the partner said she's my friend. And the same way when you have relationships like with like non-romantic relationship with your friends, you do whatever you need to do to try and make them happy, and they'll do vice versa. You're not looking at the relationship as again transactional or rules based. It's more value based, and you appreciate, and especially if you've got a good friend and you appreciate them, is because of what they've done for you and things like that. So you're taking that into your memory bank, and obviously when there's times where maybe you're going through a difficult period, you're going to also remember obviously what they've done for you. So you're not just going to tell them, oh, but I'm doing X, Y, and Z for you. You don't think when you talk about your friends, you don't think about it like that. Like in
Yeah.
terms of how do you maintain a friendship. But for whatever reason, when people get married or in a relationship, they don't view that relationship as like their friends. And
Mm,
I think that's I think if people, I mean, it could be nice if everyone does marry their friend, but if they can or even develop that friendship, so it's not just yeah, we're husband and wife, but you should have that friendship. And I think if you look at it like that, and also as you mentioned, which I loved about the values, and you're still in the values even from a relatively young age, and consent, which is part of that. A lot of these issues that people have, I think people can resolve them by themselves,
yeah.
because you know it's even a lot of people when like going to a counselor or therapist, it's like they just need an intermediary to just communicate what I'm saying. I can't communicate it to my spouse, so because and then you can break it down to say, and a lot of it is because it's not that we don't have the vocabulary. It's just because I think maybe the way we see each other is, oh, you're just a mother of my child, you're just a father of my child, or you're just the person that I'm allowed to fulfill my desires with lawfully. It's like all of these that type of language, rather than seeing it as no, you're my intimate partner, but also my friend, and I value you as a person. And I think that's important because the same way you have a special relationship with a friend as opposed to someone who's not your friend, not that you don't like that person, you have a special connection with someone that's your friend, so you're going to do things for them because you value that relationship. But if you don't value your partner, your wife, or your husband as a friend, I think again it would just be kind of very much rules based in terms of I'm doing this, so therefore you're supposed to do that for me.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that, what we really need to do is foster those relationships, right? That communication, that friendship that you talk about between a husband and a wife. And I think to do that, you really need to have that open communication. I think that a lot of times when you have that communication breakdown, that's when that intimacy also breaks down. That's when everything starts to fall apart, right? I think that when you start seeing each other as roommates
Yeah,
instead of as friends, then things just start to fall apart. You're not even talking anymore. All of a sudden there's stonewalling, all this stuff. And I think that all really the basis of all of this is a breakdown of communication. And I think when we learn to communicate, and I think also, Habib, I would have to say that respect is a huge component, right? Whether or not, because when you're friends with somebody, you respect them, you value their opinion. And I see oftentimes in relationships that are falling apart that respect also is not there in that relationship, right? That the husband or maybe the wife they don't respect each other, and they don't listen to each other, that they're not communicating. And I think all of those things just start to fall apart. So I think one of the key things, I think in any relationship, I would say, is communication and respect. I would say. What would you say?
no, I'd agree. I was going to ask something else. It might be controversial, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you think that again, obviously within a Muslim context, do you think because a number of Muslims don't have friends with the opposite sex, do you think that I mean, do you think it would help if people like? I'm just thinking. I think if people have like, I believe as a man, you can have a relation, like a friendship with a woman, and it's not sexual. It's not going to turn into anything sexual, and that can also help your relationship because you can see the woman's perspective, and you can value women for being human beings, and likewise for women having friendships with men. But I think if you're growing up in an environment where you're just around, you don't have any friends, like whether it's a professional level or otherwise, with the opposite sex, you're just in an echo chamber. So men would just talk about men this way, women are women would, and I hate it both ways. And that's why even sometimes when you get into a relationship or married, you just see them. Oh, this is how they're like the whole Mars versus Venus. And
Yeah.
that's why I just think that sometimes having, again, some people will go crazy, but I think having like healthy relationships with the opposite sex where you can value and appreciate, like you said, and respect their opinion, and you wouldn't have that unless you're attuned to what women are saying, or with men. Well, men are more likely to have that because they listen to men all day. But I don't think enough. Like I'll be honest, a lot of men find it difficult to listen to a woman, and I find that's problematic. and these are people that are so-called religious because
Yeah.
of they'll use the whole fear of fitna, and I'm like, you're watching a screen on YouTube. Do you
Yeah.
know what I mean? But I think that's for me. That's because if you're just obviously around men, obviously men, there's a lot of things that we do that we might not necessarily see. You're gonna, like I say, be an echo chamber. So that I think that also plays a role, that when you're having this complete segregation of not being able to interact in a healthy manner or with women, and this starts even before marriage, because then you could, when you get into a relationship or marriage, you then will learn to understand and appreciate, and not be like, oh, that's just the way women are.
Yeah.
You hear these like statements, oh, that's just the way, this is the way men are. Allah's created us like this. And it's
Yeah.
just like it's very like, and I'm thinking you probably haven't had much healthy relationships with women. That's why you think like that.
Yeah.
Because even maybe something that you're going through in your, relationship or your marriage, you're going to generalize and say all women are like that. Whereas if you've had relationships, not necessarily romantic relationships with different women, you won't think like that. But
Yeah.
if you're just gonna go by your sample of one or maybe two, because you're including your mother, but she's different because she's an angel, or sample of three, your sister, then that's all. That's the representation of all women, and I just think that's what has that doesn't help. So I definitely think people having like, and I think you can develop that respect for women if you're able to listen to women and not just see them as a source of fitness. And I think having friendships of the opposite
Yeah.
sex, I think that can be healthy.
Yeah, I think that you're right in a sense, but I just wonder like how you start that conversation, because as we know in some of the cultures, right? Some of the cultures, the interpretations, like you were talking about, like the Hanafi versus the Salafi versus Maliki, Hanbali, Shafi, all of those different schools of thoughts have different views on interactions between men and women. And I think that it gets confusing when we listen to the people that say that they're the scholars in those areas, because they of course all have their own interpretations. I think that it really starts from young
Yeah,
childhood, right? I think learning how to interact with each other and learning to respect each other. And I think that starts with the parents teaching the kids how to interact with people of the opposite gender
mm,
and how to treat both people with respect. And I think as you get older, if you can see your parents modeling that, where they're able to interact with other people in a respectful, kind manner, then I think that you also ingrain in yourself, right, those same values. And so then hopefully the thought is that you will continue that, and then you can share that with your own children. I think that's just really tough when you all of a sudden you're listening to something, or there's somebody that you really respect and they start teaching you something else, something that's very different, that you don't interact at all, that you don't talk to people of the opposite gender. I think then that gets really confusing, and then you really don't know how to interact. Like, for example, I'll tell you, there was a young child, let's say he's 18, and he says to me, I'm telling you basically about my son, but he says to me, he's like, I don't know, we can't have any friends. We can't talk to anyone of the opposite gender. And I was like, where did you get that from? I
right.
said, of course, you're going to talk to some, if you have to talk to them about school or whatever, you're going to talk to somebody. He's like, no, that's what they teach us in Saturday school. They tell us that we can't talk, we can't look, we can't do that. And, I think when we make it so difficult to practice a religion, I think then that's when people start to look away, right?
And
I
people
think we're
burn out. People burn out. It's unrealistic. I had that for a period, and so again, it's unrealistic because you start to again because a is this idea, because then it's um bind to this into this idea that as a man you have no self control, you've got no self restraint, you've got no sexual discipline, which is the opposite of what Islam is teaching. That you're supposed to have sexual discipline, you're supposed to have self restraint.
right,
And again, someone who's speaking, yes, they can say whatever they like, but you still have to function in this world, and you're going to meet women of the opposite. Like you can't always run to your scholar and it's going to, oh, what do I do in this situation?
right,
You're going to have to work. So again, this is where going back to what you said about the values, is if you've got those values instilled from a relatively young age, even though someone might be saying X, Y, and Z, you should know what is respectable conduct. You should know what when you're crossing the line and things like that. But when you're just looking at things like black and white, that I cannot talk to a woman, and again, especially living in the US, it's not realistic. I mean, if you're living in another part of the world where, so that's why I just think and even a number of the teachers that some of the teachers that used to say that 20 years ago. They've now changed their tune. And for me, what was just heartbreaking is that why was you saying that message in 20 years ago when you knew that wasn't realistic and practical? That's my
Right.
point. You knew
Right.
because they themselves, because I remember when I was like your son's age, they were saying some of the mosques I used to tend to, you have to leave university because it's haram. It's ikhtilat, there's free mixing, there's music there. And I was contemplating out of religious sincerity, maybe I have to leave university, not knowing that those same preachers, a number of them were sending their children to mixed schools, even
Yeah.
away from, even in another country. This is, and I was just like, that's what really irritated me is that if they actually believed a lot of what they were saying, fair enough, and they were living that life, but a lot of them they don't believe 100%. In that strict, absolute. There's one thing of saying in terms of yes, you should lower your gauge to be chaste, but then also there's dealing with reality.
Right.
So you could just say these principles that Islamically we know what we're supposed to do, but you're talking to adults, and when I mean adults, technically anyone over from an Islamic perspective over puberty is responsible person. So they are going to then have to find out themselves in terms of how they have to behave. But you know, offering these prescriptions, which I think a lot of religious preachers do nowadays, that wasn't what a lot of the scholars of the past did. They kind of gave guidelines, and then you kind of navigate yourself around that. But when you're giving prescription that this is how you're supposed to behave, you're not supposed to any woman, you're not supposed to talk to her. It's just like it's not realistic, and that's where,
Right.
like I said, the people will burn out or be like the religion is too much.
Yeah.
I can't do, and I just think that's what we don't want. So,
Right.
um, but yeah,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it's been such an engaging conversation. I just love it. I feel like, we could be talking for hours, but, I'd love to know what you would like the viewers to leave with, maybe like a pearl or something. And we've talked about so many things. We talked about consent. We've talked about how different cultures view sex and sex positivity. And we've talked about, marital relationships and all of those great things. What say is like one pearl that you would love the listener to leave with?
one pearl that Islam is a not only a sex positive, pleasure based religion, but it's one that is governed by principles and ethics. I think that's something that's important because whilst we always think about the halal and haram, like the legality, I think oftentimes we lose sight of the ethics of the religion. That the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, not only did he outline the laws, but he also outlined ethical principles, and those ethical principles are those which are universal. We should extract to kind of live our lives to be good human beings and beneficial human beings for both men and women alike. So I think the ethical principles of Islam, I think a lot of people kind of lose sight of that and they get bogged down into the legal rulings or some controversial hadiths that makes people feel like the religion is impractical. So I think the ethics is important. And a lot of that is from the Quran.
Yeah. That's amazing. Also, like the fact that you mentioned that Islam is a pleasure-based religion, which I think that nobody really relates Islam and pleasure. Nobody relates like Muslims and sex, right? So I think that that's very good that you bring that up and I like how you made a distinction between erotology and sexology in the beginning because I think that that was really an important distinction that you made. So I appreciate you doing that. So what would you tell somebody? How can people get in touch with you? So people are listening to this, they're thinking, wow, Habeeb Akande is fantastic. I love his work. How can they get in touch with you? How can they buy your books? Where can they get all that? I know I bought my books on Amazon, by the way. It's
Yeah,
not
so
a
my books are on Amazon as well as I think now meccabooks.com are now stocking them if you're based in the US. I've got a number of courses now on Erotology Institute. So if you want to delve in more deeper in terms of understanding erotology and the science behind it, and I'm also going to be going to breaking down some like classical books of erotology and going to in a lot more detail. And I'm also now just releasing some clips on like YouTube. Some you can Habeeb Akande, I think it's yeah on YouTube. So I've released a couple of like series called Fiqh Without Ethics, where I'm talking about problematic issues such as like temporary marriage, where
Mm,
people have, I would argue, have manipulated or misused fiqh or certain fatwas to kind of exploit, unfortunately, Muslim women. So that's and also talk about like, the importance of consent from an Islamic framework and giving people the sources both from in English as well as I'm explaining in Arabic so they can see the sources where I'm getting this information from. So yes, Erotology Institute. I'm on Instagram as well, Habeeb Akande, and on Twitter and on Facebook. But Twitter's, if you want some entertainment, maybe you can check out my Instagram page.
Yeah. No, your Instagram page is fantastic. I love your Instagram page. Actually, gosh, I wish I would have gotten into this a little bit, maybe for another podcast. But temporary marriages, there were so many of those happening. And I will tell you, when I went to a university for undergraduate, and it was mostly amongst, I will say, I don't want to call out this culture, but I'll say it was mostly amongst the Lebanese Shia individuals, and they would have muta. Is that correct?
What
Is that
are, yeah.
yeah?
So
And they would do that like it was rampant. It was awful.
yeah, so this is where again I'm trying to empower people, especially the women, to understand what their rights and what Islam says. So from I'm a Sunni Muslim, so from a Sunni perspective, mut'a, which is called pleasure marriage, that's what mut'a means, pleasure. It's a temporary marriage. It's not allowed. But in
Mm.
Shia Islam, it's permitted. So they still say that there's two types of marriage: a permanent marriage and a mut'a marriage, where you can marry someone for a fixed period of time, whether it's a week, two
Oh
months, or
wow.
what have you. Yeah, it's actually
Mhm.
so. Yeah, it's agreed upon when they have the contract. I'm going to get married for like a trial period. So that's something that is in Shia Islam, and their scholars say it's perfectly permissible. So that's why, yeah, amongst Shia it's something that is not even. It's unfortunate some women aren't aware of it. Some women are aware of it. So again, it's just like a consensual relationship. Now, unfortunately, amongst the Sunnis, we have a number of Muslims who are doing some mut'ah type marriages, but the women are
Mm.
not aware of it. So there's a
Oh
type of marriage called marriage with the intention of divorce, which is really, and this is where again, where if you don't
wow.
have ethics, so there are some legal scholars who said that if a man gets married, I mean, so if a man has the intention to divorce a woman, but he doesn't vocalize it, or he doesn't obviously write it down on the contract, then the marriage is still valid. So
Wow.
what you found a number of Muslims were doing, and this even when I was studying in Egypt, they will marry a woman, just say for example, when they're in Egypt or when they're going back to their home country for a couple of months, with the intention of divorce, but because they don't vocalize it, so it's like a temporary marriage, just to fulfill their desires. Now with them, they're thinking, oh, the marriage is legal, it's halal. When really, so what it is again, this is where again, like I said, it's fit about ethics, because if they were to ask a scholar, if I marry a woman but I have the intention of divorce, is my marriage contract valid? Now, from a legal perspective, it's valid because it fulfills the conditions of marriage. Does that
Mm.
make sense? So they'll say, yes, your marriage is valid. So they'll take from that it's halal, meaning it's permissible. But not everything that is legal or valid from a legal perspective is Islamic or right to do. Does that make sense? And
Yeah.
this is where again people play with like the law, because really they're deceiving themselves. They're not deceiving Allah. So this is where, like again, you've got people, and these are people who are outwardly very religious. These are even preachers that are doing this. There's a number of like people that are traveling who are doing this, and it's even rampant in parts of the US, where people, because they know a lot of these legal like rulings, so it's like I'm just going to pick and choose. So because a scholar said something, like for me, when I read that, I don't, with all due respect to that particular scholar, just because he said that, it doesn't mean I believe that's a correct opinion, you know. But because people have this legalistic approach that because a scholar says this is okay, therefore it is okay. So unfortunately, you have a lot of these, and again, because it's a number of people who are practicing and religious, they will use this as a justification to basically deceive women, and the women, a lot of them, they don't know better. At least with the Shia one, it's a consensual relationship. The women know this is a temporary marriage. With the marriage with the intention of divorce, the women are none the wiser. They're thinking this is like a long-term marriage. We're going to live the rest of our lives as husband and wife, not knowing he's got this loophole, this legal loophole, to deceive a woman. And again, it's destroyed a number of families. A number of women I know have left the religion or stopped practicing altogether, because a lot of the women who are targeted are new Muslims, like converts, reverts, or women who are like single mothers or divorcees. So they'll use this like, so that's a type of temporary marriage. There's another type of temporary marriage called misyar. There's a lot of these, and again, unfortunately, it's people who are, it's not all, but some people who are like who have studied, so aware of these technicalities, shall we say. But even though it's ethically immoral and it's un-Islamic, but because they will use, oh, such and such scholar said it's permissible because I read it in such and such fatwa, and I'll show that to the woman. To the woman think technically what he did is halal. not knowing the difference between halal or being authentic or valid from a legal perspective is not the same as something being good and right from an Islamic perspective. So again, that's why yeah, I released a couple of like videos and stuff because I don't know if you saw, there was a recent case of a prominent online Muslim like preacher, and he offered like a temporary marriage to a single mother woman, Muslim woman. He said that he's in a, in a, in a way, he basically said, would you consider getting married to me until I find a virgin woman that my
Oh
family will settle with? That's what he said. So essentially, marry, and it's a secret marriage. So do you mind, marry me? And he was like, mashallah, because divorce. I mean, divorced women and single mothers, they've got their own house, they've got their own finances. So I don't need to provide for you finance, and you don't need to have a big nikah because mashallah. And all of this, it was all over social media. But I'm well aware of this. Unfortunately, these type of unscrupulous men who are using the religion to take advantage of the women, and a lot of the women are none the wiser because they think. Fortunately, that was addressed, but that has been going on for years. That's been going on for years, and that's why again I wanted to talk about fiqh with ethics, because they will use like the fiqh because they can cite a fatwa from a scholar, and the woman thinks, oh, this is Islamic, this is what Islam says, and not every ruling a scholar says, even if it's a prominent scholar, it doesn't mean that A is correct and B you have to follow it. But because Muslims haven't been empowered even just to a basic level, because you don't need to necessarily, or like what you said earlier about if something doesn't feel right, I'm not going to accept it. And that's even a principle from the Prophet, peace be upon him, where he said that even if everyone is giving you a fatwa, consult your heart. If you want to know what's right, what's wrong, consult your heart. So this is a basic principle that even Muslims, we should understand, that just because someone has studied somewhere, has a big beard and saying all this version of Quran, consult your heart. If something doesn't feel right, you don't accept it. And that's just something like, again, I just think that maybe not enough of us have been empowered to that sense where we can question. You don't necessarily need to question publicly, but even question to yourself a challenge. And that's just something which I thought, because I've seen more than enough of these exploitation, I thought let me just put out some videos so people can kind of understand the kind of some of the tricks and the legal loopholes that people are using, which is clearly not Islamic, but unfortunately people are doing it in the name of Islam.
Wow. Well, I am so glad you are out there putting those videos out, because that was something that I had not heard about. And that is so unfortunate that, people learn about the religion, they find the loopholes, and then they use it to serve their own pleasure and their fantasies and all this other stuff, right? So they're using it for their own good, and not even for their own good, but really their own pleasure, right? It's just to satisfy their own pleasure. And then, once they're done, it's just like they're just throwing away the other person, which is really unfortunate. So I'm glad you're putting out those YouTube videos, because that's really important. Well, we are done, and it's been real and really intimate. And remember, this was definitely not meant to be any type of religious advice. So if you have any questions about your religion, please go and speak with your friendly neighborhood religious scholar. And until next time, this is the Muslim Sex Podcast. So thank you for listening to the podcast, and make sure you leave us a review, share and like the podcast. And if you leave me a review, I'd love to shout you out on social media. So be sure that you share it with all your friends. And thanks for listening.